So I'd like to kick off that 235 years after the first Pfandbrief, so 15 years ago, the Pfandbrief market was very well represented by the VDH, as it was then, and had a strong support in both Berlin and Brussels, and was the dominant part of which we now call the covered bond market. Given that, why did you think that a pan-European body for covered bonds was needed?
Well, the VDH, which was the former VDP, had a long tradition in representing mortgage banks and their interest in granting loans, mortgage loans, and funding those loans through Pfandbriefe. And on a European level, there was only the loan side was represented by the European Mortgage Federation. And having worked in Brussels for a couple of years, I was fully aware that if you really wanted to implement a product with all the regulatory privileges that it had on a national level, you really needed European regulation to have in place, to have these privileges granted on a European level, because otherwise it wouldn't be possible to keep them on a national level. So to lobby for a product which is only a domestic product and you don't have European partners and no European interest would be very difficult. So for me it was logic to say, okay, we need some kind of a European body that represents not only the interest when it comes to mortgage lending, but also when it comes to funding. And that was how the idea was created. And then I must also honor Euromoney, I must say, at that time, because the VDH had started with Pfandbrief conferences, which were quite successful. We were in London, we were in the United States, we were in Japan. And then I still remember a conference in London where John at that time came to me and said, Louis, what do you think about not only presenting the Pfandbrief, but also presenting covered other like. At that time, we didn't know anything about covered bond. It was always Pfandbrief-like instruments. And so I said, well, it sounds quite interesting. And then Euromoney started the first conference, I don't know.
2003 in the Acora.
2003, and the interest was immense. Yeah. So that showed me, there's much more international and European interest. And therefore, we said, now let's go and try to establish a European lobby organization. And then another thing was important. At that time, everybody said, oh, Pfandbriefe, that's so boring. Much more sexy are mortgage-backed securities. So there was a huge drive of, securitization going into Europe. So I told myself, is there any European answer to that? And I said, well, we have our own securitization since more than 200 years, which is Pfandbrief, and Pfandbrief-like other instruments like in Denmark or in France or wherever. So why don't we come up and say, come on, there's other sexy instruments there, even if they're older than 200 years, you can be sexy. So let's make a covered bond a true European answer to mortgage-backed securities. And that's how the whole thing started.
It sounded like that was a massive plug for Euromoney. I'd asked you that question on purpose, but I didn't. I should have done. And so, Luca, from your perspective then, can you tell us about the original remit of the ECBC and how is it different, how it differed from that of the VDP? And has the original mission evolved over time, and if so, how?
Well, I think that 2004 was a very important moment for the industry. We have to recall that in Europe we had different banking models. There was a specialized mortgage system and the universal banks. And the EMF at the time was covering both these models with a strong, I would say, concentration of the specialized mortgages. The EMF was created by this family. And the banking system was changing. We were integrating the common currency, and also the German system switched from a specialized mortgage model. We had VDH at that time, and now we have a VDP. So the EMF was considered the right place to develop a kind of think tank, and Christine at the time was there, and I think that the VDP, VDH and Louis had the right inspiration to transform what was a domestic development in a European asset. And the Commission got it, because I mean, since the beginning they understood the potential of this asset class. We had to wait still a few years. I remember the call from Louis Hagen, it was at the end of August 2007, saying, Luca, now the situation is getting really serious. And actually, the world was changing. It was a few days before the Berlin conference, and we were entering in what ended up in Lehman. Lehman changed this market, and I think put the covered bonds in a completely new space. There were two things clear in 2008, that first of all, you need a clear covered bond legislation. So all the structured models like HBOS had to be captured in a legislative box. And then secondly, it made clear that the on-balance sheet solution was much more a good solution for financial stability purposes than other models. So this was, I think, clearly blessed by the European Commission as the future. And then we started to have a proper role. The ECBC, fortunately, was there, was a small working group, and got a lot of attention. We started to receive calls from Brussels, from the European Commission, from the European Central Bank. You know the strong intervention of Michel Stub at that time. And then we arrived to receive calls from all the countries around the globe asking what is a covered bond, how we can implement it. And the ECBC changed little by little. At that time, I think we had only 60 members, more or less, at the creation. Now we have 122 members from all over the world. So that was the driver of change.
And obviously, you, with our dynamic pool, we're much better anyway. From the German issuers, there was some resistance, obviously, in establishing the lobbying organisation like the ECBC with other covered bonds. Can you expand on how that played out?
Well, I must say that from the German mortgage banks that were represented by the VDH, from the beginning there was a strong support. Because the idea was really, I would say, the idea was compelling. And you must also take into account the time when that happened, which was 2004. And that was 1 year before the Mortgage Bank Act was abolished and the Pfandbrief Act took over the issuance to govern issuance of Pfandbrief. So for the VDH, it was a certain question of, you know, how would things continue? And we had to somehow reinvent the association and the representing of the interest of issuers of Pfandbriefe. So the answer was really, we want to have all the Pfandbrief issuers in the association, which was our goal. At that time, there was resistance from some of the public sector, lenders like the Landesbanks, who are fortunately now members of the VDP. But to really have a convincing story that this new organization that we were creating, the VDP, would be one which would play a role not only in Germany, but also on a European scale, we really needed a lobby organization on the European level. And so therefore, they said, yeah, and we had this answer, and we knew what we were discussing on the European level, and that we were at the verge of creating the ECBC. So we had all you know, we had everything in our pocket already and said, you know, this is the association, and therefore, and I'm very happy that the mortgage banks and all, they all supported that from the beginning on very strongly, and so there was no true opposition on that. Of course, there's always the issue, but that makes the market interesting, that you always want to have, you know, the product which is the best or seen as the best. But that's competition, and that makes life, I think, much more interesting.
And the purist was one of the arguments, wasn't it?
Yeah, well.
Obviously, the ECBC sits, or not obviously, maybe some people, it rose out of the EMF, the European Mortgage Federation. Given that some of the, which makes the two organisations seem like they were synonymous, but of course they weren't, and there were big differences, particularly because many covered bonds are not backed by mortgages. Can you explain, Luca, how that's all played out and what the implications for issuers of the work for your members was in how the two associations work together?
Well, we have always seen, I would say, the EMF ECBC as one entity. I think they are simply two faces of the same coins, as I said yesterday in the plenary. I think you don't have covered bonds if you don't have a good asset. And the EMF, I think, is very much looking at the asset side of the business, which I think is a common denominator for covered bond issuers and also non-covered bond issuers. There are retail, illegal issue, valuation problems that have to be tackled at the European level. I think it's impossible not to see the mortgage market as a non-European. Of course, it's rooted on national markets, but the solutions now are completely in the hands of our legislators in Brussels. We have seen this with the Mortgage Credit Directive, and most probably the revision of this directive will arrive very, very soon. So the EMF is focused on the asset side, and the ECBC has been looking at covered bonds mainly, but also, I would say, to other funding sources. So, I mean, we look also at securitization and other assets, and we try to act as a catalyst for market solution, market initiative. And because of the success of covered bonds in the crisis, I would say, this is maybe now the more visible part of our organization. But I have to say, we could not have an ECBC so strong and so solid without an EMF strong, robust, and able to take action from the very beginning and from the asset side. So I think that this is an unicum that has to be seen as a good asset for this industry in Brussels.
So Louis, over to you. Unlike the Brits nowadays, we were quite controversial sometimes around covered bonds. Now, of course, we're the quiet man of Europe. In the year of the foundation of the ECBC, HBOS launched its first structured covered bond, and then our hallowed friends at Northern Rock had the first soft bullet. Some organisations might have wanted to exclude these upstarts, but you were very open to them. So would you explain why?
Well, the Brits always do things different from the continent. But honestly, at that time, it really was unthinkable to create a European organization without having the British on board.
Maybe where we are today is HBOS's fault.
But and I still believe that the UK should remain instead of Brexit, and I hope that the UK issuers will stay on board with the European Covered Bond Council, and that may be the new start of the history, you know. But covered bonds are an instrument that are linked very much to the local law, of course, and especially local insolvency law. So therefore, and since insolvency law is so different in different countries, you know, the products look different, and they have different histories. Okay, they didn't have in the UK, but as I said, it's very strongly linked to law, to local law, or national law, and also to market practices. So for me, you know, it was clear that the UK covered bond would look differently than the Pfandbrief would look like because of the different bases. So, and as long as these covered bonds are safe and solid, why should you exclude them? So therefore, and since we looked at it very deeply, and we saw they are safe and they are solid, so why shouldn't we be open? And I think that's exactly what the market participants, what the investors like. They like diversity, they like the variety of products, so they can choose. Therefore, for me, there was no question to have the UK structured covered bonds also on board.
So the UK obviously is a questionable European ally, or in Europe, is it or isn't it? Further out from Europe itself, of course, your original remit was the European Covered Bond Council, but the ECBC decided to get involved in developing covered bond jurisdictions further afield. Did you ever face concerns from Europeans that this might contribute to the creation of rivals to covered bonds in Europe? And if so, how did you respond?
Well, that's a spicy question, and I will answer with a spicy answer. Well, I mean, I think that is very much a philosophical question. I think the spirit of Louis Hagen initiative to create, to transform a national body in a European platform arrived at the point which was, I think, the September Steering Committee on 2010, which was in Vienna, if I'm not mistaken, where the industry faced two big questions. Should we tackle the development of covered bonds in a defensive way at the national level, or should we play an aggressive role and go for Basel? Clearly, at that time, just to recall, the Basel Committee was trying to draft a reaction paper to the crisis and set the capital requirements for the new financial architecture. There were two schools of thought in that steering committee. There was the first one, which was, I would say, a more traditional side of the market, very much national-centric, not nationalist, national-centric, which was saying covered bonds is a domestic story. The ECBC should play a role as a European architecture, but should not go behind this, because the future of the covered bond is with our national authority. That was their strategic view, which actually in the discussion resulted quite isolated. And the majority of the people in the steering committee, they seen that the ECBC should take action in Basel, because only by tackling the Basel committee, we could actually have a good protection of the asset class, because Basel was the future. So we had the green light to intensify our lobbying with the Basel committee. A gentleman that most of you knows, before leaving for Korea in November, was fully briefed by us, Mario Nava, before sitting in the committee of the Basel committee. And that gentleman of the European Commission succeeded to position covered bonds in the second comment round of the Basel paper. And you have all seen that in December 2010, for the first time, covered bonds were captured in the Basel paper. Of course, the two schools of thoughts remain alive in the group. People were not happy with the label, for example, which was, I think, a derivation of this kind of global approach. We have done the first trip to Asia in a clandestine situation just to see if we could develop a global community. Now, as a matter of fact, I think history gave a clear result of what was the good strategic view to follow. Now, in 2017, the Basel Committee has confirmed the role of covered bonds. And this is because I think the majority of the issues around the table at that time decide to go global and not remain national-centric, which was the right decision that has been taken from my personal point of view. Like the label, now, I mean, I'm very proud to say that we have 128 labels around. We have more labels than ECBC members, which is good. But it means that the globalization of the asset class has now got the final result, so from my point of view.
So moving from the label, I mean, 15 years ago when you were setting up the ECBC, for the idea of them to help check the directive, the covered bond label, help with new jurisdictions and the transparency template, if I could say that. Was this what you'd expected to see 15 years ago?
Well, I must confess, not really. Not really. Well, it started, I think we started with 20 members when the ECBC was founded, and just half a year later there were 60 members. Now, as Luca said, there are 122 or 122 members. So I must say that I'm really overwhelmed by this success. But what's the reason behind it? I think the reason is why it was so successful, because from the start on, different from the VDP, who represents really mainly issuers, we were open and said, you know, we want all market participants to be there and to be members, and that gave the whole organization really, I would say, a great push, because there were so many. Well, the covered bond community doesn't only consist of issuers. You need, of course, you need the investors. But you also need the investment banks, you need the rating agencies, you need, of course, you have to be in contact with the regulators. So that gave the big, this was really something new, where you had the whole community. And the second thing is that all of them were really interested in foster this in this market and to make it really a successful market. So the ECBC, I would say, is a rather lean organization, and it can only be that lean because there's the willingness of the members to really contribute in the committees and thereby create really the knowledge and expertise that the ECBC then Luca and his great team then represent and when they speak to the regulators and to the central banks and so on. So it's also the members that are pushing, and of course it's always people. You know, there were always people who were very supportive and said, you know, let's make that happen. So I think that, and that of course includes Luca, whom I know when he was still a baby, in means of Pfandbrief, of course. And I remember when he first came in contact with Pfandbrief in Berlin. Where he was, you were, how do you call that? He was there for
internship,
an educational journey or something, and yeah. So now today,
do you feel
the baby has grown to a young man.
Not sure that I was educated, but I mean that's fine.
And for you, Luca, so once the directive is fully implemented, what will the next priority for the ECBC be?
Well, I think that the covered bond story is just a part of a bigger project, which is building a European architecture. And our job over these last years has been always to position the covered bond product in the dynamic evolution of the European financial services industry. The job will continue because I think that the housing finance is a fundamental pillar of the Capital Markets Union, but also of the European project, giving hope to people, as I was saying yesterday. So our job is still there. I think that everything around the house will change. We have seen banking union, we have seen a common currency. With Madame Lagarde, I think their way of making policy will change. With this new commission, we will grow up. The integration will continue. We want and we will keep the UK community as close as possible to our heart. And the ECBC will continue to build bridges on the two sides of the channel as much as we can, because we believe that a community doesn't have frontiers, and this is included between the channel, but also for Singapore, Korea, and we will continue to provide our service at the global level to secure the business line for our members, but also the inclusion of this important asset class in the financial architecture that Europe is designing, but the Basel Committee is designing. And we have to provide answer on a weekly basis. So our job should be really to provide answer as a community, with one voice, to all the European and global institutions working. The World Bank was yesterday, IMF is very active, EBRD, ECB, EIF. All these institutions need to have answers and responses, and that's our job, I think, provide a common answer as a European body.
And finally, Louis, what would you think the ECBC will be working on in 15 years? Your crystal ball.
I'm not a visionary. So I take one step after the other.
Slow and steady wins the race.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's how the Pfandbrief works,
yeah,
you know.
Exactly.
No, I think, of course, covered bonds are so successful because they also adapt to the challenges and the needs, the societal needs that are there in real economy. I believe that, you know, property, houses, apartments, offices, hotels, retail, shops, everything that will remain and will always be important. I guess that the green wave has only started yet, and that, I guess, well, that's an issue that will be important for the next at least 100 years. I think that will that will grow. So, but we don't know yet what kind of challenges will be ahead of the covered bond industry. But I strongly believe that we will always have answers. So that's
Hopefully it'll be okay.
what I think.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
As long as Britain doesn't get involved, I'm sure it'll be okay.
Maybe ask Luca.
Yes, Luca,
He's the man of the future.
15 years, so it means...
Surely we'll be retired, won't we?
we will be green.
Yes,
that's for sure.
We'll be green,
that's the only thing. Let's see what will happen. I mean, let's follow one step at a time, as Louis was saying.
Excellent. Well, thank you both very, very much. It's been nice looking back at what's happened in the covered bond market in the last 15 years. If everyone would like to join me in thanking my panelists, my speakers.